Hi, Joshua.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing very well.
How's Oklahoma?
Oklahoma it's a beautiful day, spring day. We're looking for some good weather here.
Yeah, spring is busting out all over, if not summer in some places. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You're Joshua Landis. One of the country's foremost authorities on Syria, I would say, and you teach at the University of Oklahoma. And you do this very valuable blog, Syria Comment, that I encourage everyone to check out. And you've been on Blogging Heads before, talking about Syria. And I just wanted to interrogate you a little bit about how you see things playing out. The last blog post of yours that I read, which you posted, I think, on Monday, was a pretty bleak assessment. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I must say I've had a rather bleak view of how this is going to play out. But the first article I wrote about the Syrian uprising it was early April, I believe, was about how there was no soft landing for the Assad regime. And it's a very narrow regime. There's, of course, the ethnic dimension to it, the religious communal dimension to it. And there's also a class dimension to this struggle. And that complicates things. This is the last minoritarian regime in the Middle East. Now that the Maronites fallen in Lebanon.
The minority being Alawites.
Yeah, Alawite regime, 12% of Syria, religious.
By the way, can you just say a word about what Alawites are? It's such an obscure sect.
Alawites are heterodox Shiites, and what that means is that they, if you want to think of it in an American context, they are the Mormons of Syria. They add a book and they add a prophet. They actually do more than adding a prophet, but they're a Gnostic religion. It's a secret religion. They have secret books. Only males above 15, or usually they get initiated, are allowed to be initiated, but very few people do go through the work that it takes to be initiated. And they believe in reincarnation of souls. They believe in a very botany, internal, mystical interpretation of the Quran. So they don't follow the 5 pillars of Islam.
Really?
They don't have mosques in general, although they have built some of late, but they're fairly empty. And they have shrines, saints' shrines, sort of. And they believe that Ali, they have a trinity. Ali is the mana, or the meaning, and Muhammad is the veil, the outward appearance. And Salman al-Farisi, the first Persian convert to Islam, is the Bab, or the mouthpiece of this trinity. Of course, they believe it's all one. It's an emanation of this great creator. But so this is very heterodox in a sense, and most Muslims traditionally have not accepted them as Muslims. That changed in modern Syria, where you got some fatwas, particularly Shiite fatwas, claiming them as Muslims. But Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, the president and dictator of Syria, really asserted that Alawites were Muslims, got Alawite sheikhs to denounce the notion that Ali is considered God by Alawites, and has tried to mainstream, to a certain degree, Alawites. Of course, most people think that's just a trick, and it's taqiyya, some kind of... But Alawites themselves are quite confused about their own religion these days. You talk to most young Alawites.
You mean about whether they're Muslims?
Well, they all consider themselves Muslims, in the same way that a Mormon would consider themselves Christian, in a sense. But they think they're the best Muslims, of course. And other people aren't following the true Islamic message. This is,
a common view of people, that they are the finest representative of the larger body.
It is. Everybody's a chosen person.
Yeah.
And Alawites are no different. They think that they're good and that they've got the truest and best word, just like every other Muslim and every other religious person.
But to what extent does this begin, in the first instance, really as a religious conflict? In other words, to what extent does the doctrine have much to do with the strife, as opposed to just the fact that these are different ethnic groups which have maybe had different levels of access to power and have different socioeconomic circumstances, and so on?
That's a very good question. It's a chicken and egg question, because under Sunni rule and under the Ottomans until 1920,
Mm-hmm.
the Alawites were not allowed to appear in court and give evidence in court because their word was untrustworthy as people who had not received a message from the sky.
Mm-hmm.
Christians and Jews, being people of the book, could give and appear in court and give evidence, but not Alawites because they're considered to be heretics who are beyond ghulu, who are extremists, who are beyond the pale.
They were further from Islam than Christians and Jews, it was thought.
Absolutely. And Christians and Jews are protected religions who come from the same Godhead and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Alawites just go off, are considered by mainstream Muslims to be too different.
Mm-hmm.
The same way that an evangelical Christian would say that a Mormon, by adding Joseph Smith in the book, their book, have done too much to be considered Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Mormons, of course, consider themselves Christians. Now, in America, we've solved that problem by separating church and state. We've solved it legally. Of course, somebody like Mitt Romney still has a problem because he's got to convince evangelicals that he's a Christian, or at least he's got to get them to vote for him. But it's not a constitutional problem. In Syria, it is, because the Constitution states that the president must be a Muslim. And that forces the Alawites to be Muslim, in a sense. And they've tried to do that. When Assad tried to disaggregate that in 73 and do a new constitution that said it didn't say that the president had to be a Muslim, there were big riots and demonstrations, and he rescinded that and went back on it and kept it in.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a religious doctrinal problem. Of course, it's much more than that, and most people don't think in terms of doctrine and so forth.
Right.
But there is a social problem, and that until 1920, the demographic segregation was almost absolute. When the French did their first census, there were almost no Alawites living in any town or city with Sunnis in it. They lived with Christians, but they did not live with Sunnis. That has changed dramatically in modern Syria, which is secular, where Alawites have moved into the cities. And you get cities like Homs today, where all the violence is, which is a third Alawite. Mostly, there's a small Christian minority there, but mostly a Sunni city. But that Alawite neighborhoods is very new.
And those were the neighborhoods not getting shelled, right?
They did not get shelled by the government. Of course, they got shelled by the revolutionary forces.
Uh-huh.
When the government attacked the revolutionary neighborhoods, what the revolutionaries couldn't strike back at the military because they had tanks and artillery from a distance. Mm-hmm. But they could lob mortars and RPGs into the Alawite neighborhoods. And which is the way they tried to get back at the government because they considered Alawites part of the government. Mm-hmm. And they kidnapped Alawites. When the government arrested their young men, they would go and kidnap Alawites who lived next door to them. And then they would try to negotiate with the government to free their prisoners. So most of the Alawites left their neighborhoods because the violence
really got
too much. Now, that does not mean that it was anything on the scale of what happened to the Sunnis in Bab al-Amr. It isn't. And I don't want to make that comparison. But there is an ethnic violence that has gotten worse over time. And so the Alawites are in this.
Okay. And why don't you give us a kind of a breakdown of the relative proportions of the ethnic groups? So the Sunnis constitute about how much of the population?
Well, their Sunnis are about 75 to 80% of the population. Okay. But the Sunni Arabs, which is what we're really important here, is 65 to 70. They're about 10% Kurds that are Sunnis, but they haven't joined into this revolution and are sitting it out in a sense. They're letting the Arabs fight each other. Mm-hmm. And I think many Kurds are hoping that with a collapse of central authority, that there'll be much greater autonomy in their regions, and some of them clearly hope to be able to secede from Syria and join a Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, and eventually create a larger Kurdistan.
So they are on balance rooting for the opposition?
They are. this regime has been oppressive, and they don't like the regime.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, the opposition will not grant them the sort of national rights and autonomy that they are demanding, because the opposition is frightened that they'll secede. And there's a lot of prejudice against Kurds in Syria. So the Arab opponents, Arab opposition forces, don't want to just give them autonomy and national rights. They don't like it. They think that this is an Arab country and it should remain Arab.
Okay. So then the remainder, outside of the 75% that is Sunni, either Kurdish or not, is basically Christian and Alawite?
Christian, Alawite, there's Druze, another Shiite heterodox sect is about 3%, and then there's Ismailis, 1%, and Shiites making up a little bit more, regular 12er Shiites, about 1%, less than 1%.
And what's the breakdown between Alawites and Christians?
Alawites are 12%, Christians are about 8%.
And we expect the Christians to stick in the near term with the Alawites, with the regime, out of fear of what would happen to them under a Sunni post-revolution regime?
Yes, very much so. The Christians have been, the Christians throughout the Middle East have worked themselves into a lather of anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes from a history. They feel that they're being pushed out of the Middle East. And, Anatolia, right next door to Syria, was 20% Christian before the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
And as Turkish nationalism asserted itself, and of course the whole regional problem, they got ethnically cleansed or killed. The Armenians, 1.5 million, who were destroyed. Some fled. The Syriacs there was a big population exchange with Greece, 1.5 million exported, but many fled and ended up in Syria. So they already have a sort of complex, a Masada complex, if you will, and an anxiety. Then they look at Egypt, they look at the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, they look at the Christian community in Iraq was destroyed, over half have fled, 300,000 of them into Syria. So they feel that with the collapse of the Alawites and this minoritarian regime that protected Christians, and it spoiled Christians in many ways, that they will now be hounded out of Syria, and that many will leave and their community will disintegrate. That's the dominant fear. So they choose, in a sense, dictatorship of the Alawites over the unknown majoritarian rule.
And then there are some Sunnis who you would expect to stick with the regime. Is that right? I mean, a number of them are actually, there are Sunnis in the regime, right? And there are upper class Sunnis.
The prime minister, the entire most of the cabinet, there's a few Alawites and a few Christians, but most of the government are Sunnis. And they have, I'm sure they're very unhappy about it, but they have stayed loyal and stayed in their positions. There have been very few top defectors.
And does it go beyond just kind of government elites? In other words, is there a large class of Sunnis, maybe kind of a commercial class or something that feels invested enough in the status quo that for the time being they're with the regime?
Yes, there is. Damascus and Aleppo have not come out. That's almost half the population of Syria have not come out, demonstrating on the streets. Now, it's partly out of fear and repression, which is heavy in both cities, but it's partly because of a class element. This uprising, the Syrian revolution, is taking place in the countryside. Deraa, this sort of forlorn Sunni tribal region down by Jordan, was a first center, but then it moved to Homs, Idlib, these central provincial cities and the countryside around them. Very poor agricultural regions hit by drought, poverty, youth explosion, unemployment. And this same rural malaise was the source of the Ba'athist revolution in the 60s. And the Sunni elites of the cities had their land taken away, their business taken away, and were nationalized by socialism. They're very worried. Only recently under Bashar were they beginning to, with the economic opening and privatization, were they beginning to feel like elites again, where they had money, they could use it, socialism was being dismantled, and they were getting rich again. Now, you've got this big uprising from the countryside, no unemployment. It's really an economic crisis driving this as much as a crisis of tyranny. Of course, it's both.
You're saying unemployment is very high out in the.
Oh, it's devastating. Syria, the UN statistics, which are lowballing, said that about 32% of Syrians were living on $2 a day or less. That's how they define poverty. We're in poverty. Now, the Syrian pound has been spiraling down and has lost about 40% of its value since the beginning of this uprising. The economy, we believe, has lost about 50% of its activity. So there are probably 50% of Syrians are living in dire poverty today. Mm-hmm. And that's going to get dramatically worse as this instability continues. We're going to get a situation like Iraq in the 1990s where people begin to starve because of sanctions, because of the political upheaval, because of the inability and the bad governance and this dictatorship and everything is conspiring against Syrians being able to feed themselves and have any stability. And that's going to be very, that just pushes more and more pressure on everybody. And it's going to make the radicalism get a lot worse. And the upper classes are terrified. They're terrified. They don't like the regime, but they want stability. They don't want to be like Iraq. They want to send their kids to school.
You mean they don't want to be like Iraq post-invasion where things fell apart?
Yes, where a decade later, they're still living in misery without any stability, worried about people kidnapping their kids. The schools are dilapidated. The national institutions have collapsed. And they wanted, they're all thinking of how to get out of Iraq. And if you're young, if you're 20 in Syria today, you are going to join that revolution because you have no future with the Assad regime.
You mean if you're 20 anywhere in Syria, or you mean if you're 20 in these regions where the revolt is?
Yeah, if you're 20 and your average Syrian is 20. Life looks bleak. It's very hard to get a job. The economy is done badly. Assad is corrupt. But if you're 50 and you have some food, you have a job, you don't want this revolution. Maybe you want it in your, at some level, but you are terrified of it because you're going to lose your country for a decade or 2 decades. And it's not going to come back together. You're going to be dead before your country gets back on its feet and you enjoy life again and have freedom and security. If you're a kid, you can spend the next 10 years or 15 years fighting the revolution and trying to get your country back together, and then you'll be 35 and you'll have the rest of your life to live in liberty, hopefully, or something that's better. If you're an older person, you don't want it. So there's a generational aspect, there's a class aspect, there's an ethnic aspect.
Okay. Final question about the composition of the opposition. Do the Christians tend to be relatively affluent and educated so that even aside from their fears about the post-revolution situation, they naturally aggregate with the upscale in this basic division you're talking about?
Absolutely. Christians have done well for a long time. They got missionary education, but it's also a minority thing. They felt that they had to get educated and get ahead. They also, a lot of Christians, for 100 years, have been migrating to Lebanon, to the United States, to the Americas, Venezuela, Argentina. They are getting tons of remittances, first of all. They have relatives living abroad. So that's opened the world to them. And plus, they had private schools until Nasser nationalized them, but they've recreated some of that. And they've been much more savvy in getting educated. Now, they tend to live in Aleppo and Damascus, in these small neighborhoods, which are really, they've closed themselves in. Many will socialize with Sunnis and so forth, but many don't. They stay within their neighborhoods. They're fearful of this big Islamic world around them, and they don't associate that much. They go to their own schools. There's still fairly deep segregation in Syria. Not segregation by any legal way, but it's a social segregation.
Yeah. So on to your kind of prognosis. Again, you've had a relatively bleak assessment all along. I remember on many months ago on Blogging Heads TV, you making the argument that this regime just isn't going to be a pushover, and do not expect. This was back when it was essentially a peaceful revolt.
The regime is tough, but there's really another problem, and that is that the opposition is so fragmented, so it lacks good leadership. Syria's problem, and it's been its problem since it was created, is that it lacks a strong sense of national political community. And that means it's very hard for Syrians to trust each other. They don't trust each other. And the political culture for the last 40 years under the Ba'athist regime and under the Assads has exacerbated that tremendously. And the Assads have exploited the divisions amongst Syrians. But they never had it. The reason that a narrow regime like the Assads could take power and hold it is because Syria was so fragmented. And many people miss that point, I think, and underestimate the difficulties Syria is going to have in avoiding becoming a failed state or a failed nation, like Iraq and Lebanon have become, and like the Palestinians are, because they don't trust each other. And you see this in the politics of the Syrian National Council. That's the umbrella organization of the opposition that's in the in the States and Europe that America has, for all intents and purposes, recognized, as well as the other European states. They are very fragmented amongst the Muslim Brotherhood, on the one hand, the Islamists, and the more seculars. But there's a lot of other fragments within that, the people who want to much more militarization, who don't want so much militarization about tactics. There are lots of different groups. And people tend to act as individuals, and they don't trust each other.
I mean, opposition can have a unifying effect. and that's why often things look better during the revolution than after, because you can hold together well enough, to get the revolution done. But then when the pressure and the external opposition is no longer there, things fall apart. But you're saying that you think the problem is so serious that they're going to have trouble getting a revolution done in the first place.
Yes, they are so far. I mean, I think what we've seen is there have been several major defections from the top ranks of the opposition, the SNC, Haitham Maleh and Labwani, Bunni. These are major players who've said that Burhan Ghalioun, the head of this organization, is keeping such a tight fist on the money and on decision-making that they accused him of being as bad as Assad and the Ba'ath Party and the dictatorship. And they're throwing around these words that are unacceptable.
So what do they defect to? Is there a rival organization?
They're creating their own alternative body that they want to get recognized by Europe.
What's it called?
It's called a Syrian, oh boy, you're going to stump me. They just announced it yesterday. It's like the Transitional Congress or something like that. Yeah. National Transitional Congress.
Okay.
They're copying the Libya model. And they're trying to make a larger umbrella group that will bring other people in. And they're worried about too much influence of the Muslim Brotherhood. But it's not.
And these are relative. Now, is this split between these rival groups to some extent a secular Islamist split?
It is. It is.
So the new group is more secular.
It is more secular. They're worried about the Muslim Brotherhood having too much power in the Syrian National Council. But it's also a revolt against this very secular leader, Burhan Ghalioun, who is keeping authority in his own hands. There's a personality clash as well. But Burhan Ghalioun, they're saying, was put at the head of this Syrian National Council because the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists wanted to have a sort of secular face so they could win support from the secular European countries who like seculars and don't want to have any truck with Muslim brothers, or at least have a veil in front of it. And and so this just raises all these questions, and then they start flinging mud and calling each other Shabiha, which is a regime thug, because they're not, they say they're not giving enough money to the arms, this Free Syrian Army. It's hard to follow. It's a very Byzantine politics, but it comes from this culture. First of all, a culture of dictatorship for 40 years. But it comes from the real lack of a Syrian understanding. And the Muslim Brothers, part of the Muslim Brotherhood, still wants to get rid of Syria's borders and create an Islamic ummah and unify the Islamic world. And they still talk in that way. Others have accepted...
So this is a more, at least that group would be more extreme by far than the mainstream of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt.
But they all use the same language. They all tend towards this same language and talk about the Ummah because it's in the Quran. It's hard. It's hard. I guess it was Yeltsin or who said, I always have communism in the back of my mind. I'm always hearing it, even though he knew it was a failure and he had to move ahead. But in a sense.
Well, Mao is still the official hero in China. You know, it's like
I do, and there is this little bit of schizophrenia in the Muslim Brotherhood of Syria. They understand that the problem at hand is a national problem, that they have to cooperate with all these other groups, that they can't talk about the Ummah and they're going to scare people. But then there's the Kurdish problem. And the Kurds, are confused about whether they want to secede, whether they want autonomy, whether they want to be Syrians and change the... Then there's the Arab nationalists who still haven't given up the notion that they're all Arabs and they should be an Arab nation. These problems have bedeviled Syria since it was created by the French, rather artificially. Mm-hmm. And Syrians have in part put them behind them, and they're acting as Syrians. Syria has borders. They call themselves Syria. They have accepted, to a large extent, Sykes-Picot and all the treaties of the First World War. But they're still defined by these older ideologies of Arab nationalism, greater Syrianism, Kurdish nationalism, Islamic Brotherhood, Islamic Ummah, and they haven't gotten rid of those yet. And so when they sit down to talk with each other, they get tangled up in these larger ideological differences that make it very hard to cooperate.
Okay. Now, you, in this recent post, you suggested that as time goes on, the opposition is going to get more and more conspicuously Islamist, partly because, well, tell me exactly why. And I should say, and also more kind of hardcore in terms of tactics. You think we're going to see more out-and-out terrorism, kidnapping, executions, which, I think is going to become a public relations problem for the opposition in supporting Western support. But describe the dynamic that you think is going to lead to this.
Well, the first 6-7 months of this uprising were largely peaceful. There were always armed groups, but they were not the dominant element of this. Mm-hmm. And the major mouthpiece the Western journalists were talking to, and that everybody talked to, were these outside the Syrian National Council, who were led by people who had been professors in France for 30 years, and people who had lived in the West and were well-to-do and spoke English and French. And we saw the more intellectual, elitist side of Syria. Those people did an extraordinary job of getting Hillary Clinton and America and the Europeans to put sanctions on Syria, to isolate Assad, to call for his overthrow, and to gang up against him. But they would not invade and do the heavy lifting and destroy the regime. Somebody has to destroy the regime. Mm-hmm. They can't do it. They're living outside the country, and they're not militant. They're not fighters. The people who are going to have to do it are these young men who don't have jobs, who have nothing to lose, and are willing to go out and risk their lives and get killed. And they are getting killed. We saw that in Homs and Idlib and the other cities where the revolutionaries took over in sort of a fit of enthusiasm and naivete, perhaps, in the first months. And then once the government decided, okay, we're going to get serious here, and began to pound them and do, take control and clear, like, American forces in Afghanistan or Iraq, they got beaten badly, and they're getting hunted down today and killed. They're going to have to fall back on their own resources. They're going to have to get guns. They're going to have to get money from the outside, but they're going to have to begin to train and be guerrilla forces. They cannot take neighborhoods and set up shop because the government is too strong for that. The Syrian army has stayed together. They're going to have to use insurgency tactics. And in order to do that, like this hit and run, terrorism, assassinations, but to do that, they're going to have to be so courageous. What available, ideology can they borrow from? They're not Marxists. They don't know about socialism or anarchists or whatever you might be, or secular nationalism. They're Muslims. The available doctrine they have is a doctrine that has worked for Hezbollah, for Hamas, for the Iraqis, for the Afghans, which is jihad and
martyrdom.
And martyrdom. And that the blood of the martyrs nourishes the tree of Islam, and that God wants us to win, and God's angels are hovering over Damascus. That's the language they use. And that we are going to win because this dictator is a heathen, an unbeliever, and tremendously damaging to Muslims. And he is inhuman. and we're going to take him down and we're going to kill him. And anybody who supports him is on the side of evil, and we are on the side of right, and God is at our shoulder, and if you're martyred, you're going to go to heaven. And so that's the ideology that I think, and you see it already in 100 different ways. You see it springing up in the small new brigades that are announcing themselves. And the classic way that Syrians join the revolution is that 20 or 30 young guys from a town or a district, neighborhood, extended families get together, they're holding guns, they make a YouTube video of themselves, and they say, we are the this and this brigade, and we are going to fight against Assad. And they announce themselves, and they become part of the Free Syrian Army. And these are popping up like mushrooms all over. They're taking Islamic names. They're going la, 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 la. They're saying Allahu Akbar. And they're using an overtly Islamic language. The fundraisers in Australia and the United States and other places are using Islamic language because that's the language of resistance. And it's the language of the Sunnis. It's the one thing that can unite them all, and it can unite them to the larger Islamic community that will hopefully give them money and support them. And, you know, the Saudis and the Gulf Arabs and others who want to destroy this Shiite
So this regime is going to look a lot like what? The insurgency in Iraq after we invaded, for example?
Yes. It's going to look like the opposition in Lebanon.
Car bombs.
Car bombs. What else can they do? They're fighting a superior army. The only thing that's worked in the Middle East are martyrdom operations, is suicide bombers. That's what's worked against America, the IED. Look at Iraq, the roadside bomb, suicide operations. Those are the things, and not sharpshooters. I suppose you could do assassinations. You know, the Syrian regime is a sitting duck. The Americans could put themselves in little fortresses and have all this very expensive armor and use drones. The Syrian regime is backwards. Their army is backwards. They're very vulnerable. They don't have armored cars. They're driving around in open trucks. They're going to get, once this insurgency gets smarter, better trained, better arms, they're going to have the Syrian army is a sitting duck out there. It's very vulnerable, and the regime's everywhere, and all those officers live in homes, and everybody knows their address.
Now, is the insurgency already getting armed in a systematic way from the outside?
No. I think the arms, everybody's talked about funding them and giving them arms, and the Saudis, the Qataris, the Yemen, even the Libyans said they're going to give $100 million. But very little of that money, I think, is really trickling in, and part of that is because they don't know who to give it to. There are hundreds of these little militias that have announced themselves, but they're not taking orders from headquarters.
But is there some small black market influx of small arms?
Sure there is, but they've got to get money and have to convince the Saudis to give them money. This little brigade that announced itself and says, I'm the Farouk Brigade or something. How are they going to convince the Saudis to give them, they've got to go out and fundraise. They don't know how to do this stuff. So, networks are forming. The Muslim Brothers are trying to create their network of Muslim Brotherhood fighters. The Free Syrian Army that's headquartered in Turkey and led by this Colonel Assad is doing the same thing, and he wants money. He called the Syrian National Council a bunch of traitors because they wouldn't give him the money so that he could set up shop and begin to really fund his fighters and buy their loyalty. So everybody's looking to buy loyalty. And the big donors, of course, want to pick the winners, and they want people who will be loyal to them, too. So they're holding back and trying to figure out, who am I going to give this money to?
So the likely donors include both governments and, you might say, NGOs, like the Muslim Brotherhood or whatever, right?
They're all fundraising, and they're getting private Gulf citizens to give them money.
And private, So, and what's your guess as to who the first big suppliers will be of money and or arms?
Well, Qatar is the spearhead of this. They've been very dramatic in their statements, saying that there should be an Arab invasion. Saudi Arabia completely put the kibosh on that. They're very anxious about not getting into a war with Syria, and setting a precedent that could backfire on them.
Saudi Arabia is anxious.
Saudi Arabia is anxious, but they want to give money. They want the Americans or some foreign country to intercede and do the heavy lifting, and they're willing to finance it, and they're willing to give money. But to really take charge and to start giving guarantees, you get sucked into this fight, and that's nobody wants. The foreign powers, despite a lot of heated rhetoric, have been unwilling to really commit themselves because then they get sucked into a swamp, and that's what they're worried about.
And it sounds like a swamp. And everything you say suggests to me that hopes of some kind of UN brokered something or other, an actual peaceful resolution would be seriously complicated by the fact that the opposition has no one representative.
Absolutely. That's the Western problem right now. That's the foreign government problem, is they're looking to sponsor somebody. They're looking for somebody who can be a spokesperson and a friendly face who will be able to go to their publics. Because today in America, if you look at the problem in America, is Americans don't want to spend a dime on Syria. There are a lot of think tanks that want to spend a lot of American money in Syria, and a lot of foreign experts and policy analysts who think that their next job is going to be, taking down the Assad regime. But, the American people, they're trying to figure out how to send their kids to school and get health care. They don't want another multi-billion-dollar swamp. So you need a good opposition that sounds good, looks good, and is convincing that if you fund them for a short period of time, they're going to do all the heavy lifting. And then they're going to rule Syria in a reasonable way, in a better way than Assad when it's all over, so that you can get the hell out of there. And you don't end up like Iraq or Afghanistan 12 years down the line with nothing but swamps, mud in your hands and nothing to show for it.
And in terms of think tanks, I mean, where is it? Have you paid much attention to where the support for intervention is coming from in terms of American politics?
Look at it. At the Council on Foreign Relations, Elliot Abrams has got the big Middle East perch now and is a dominant voice, and he wants to invade.
Don't get me started on the question of how Elliot Abrams...
Let me not say he wants to invade, but he wants America to do some kind of, to really support the opposition and to make a difference. And to get involved and take the lead. People at Brookings, some of the analysts at Brookings is torn. They just put out about an 8-person report saying that they couldn't agree on how to go about this. But there are some people who want more intervention. Then there's a bunch of right-wing organizations like Defense of Democracies, JINSA, a lot of the more pro-Israel groups that have been pretty feisty in wanting America to go in there and take down the Assads.
Although Israel itself was, for some time at least, kind of skeptical of rocking the boat in Syria.
Well, I think many people in Israel are. But there's quite a difference between the pro-Israeli groups in the United States and those in Israel. Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is perhaps the most center pro-Israeli group, and really the one with the most clout, I would say, in Washington, and has been very dominant in Middle East policy, certainly with Democrats. Their analysts advocate a much stronger role for America and a leadership role. They want America to lead, not to go, they make fun of Obama with this whole, lead from behind thing. They think a bunch of hooey. So there are a lot of people who make those arguments and say that if we don't do it now, Syrians may not get free. If we don't do it now, it's going to radicalize and become more Islamist.
Right.
And we need to pick the winners. And we need to get in there and influence people before the Saudis and other people do. Those are the sorts of arguments. And this is our big opportunity to hurt Iran, to change the balance of power. We screwed up in Iraq, and we gave the government to Shiites and pro-Iranians. But we can make up for that screw up by creating a Sunni pro-Saudi America in Syria, and that'll put paid to the bad Iraqis who thumbed their nose at us.
So one thing they're doing is kind of trying to make lemonade out of a lemon. In other words, the lemon is the fact that, wait a second, the people you would have as support are these Islamists who are going to be doing these car bombings and things that you'll just have to admit are terrorism, and they may be fighting the Christians, among other people, okay? You would think this is a serious public relations problem for somebody in America who wanted to support them, but what they're saying, it sounds like, is, well, that's why we need to get in early, before this thing gets more Islamist and more radical, and need to assert control and, guide this ship home.
That's what they said in Iraq. We're going to get in there, take out Saddam, and we're going to set up a secular power-sharing Iraq. Well, the last 3 reports out of Iraq by the U.S. administration are all that it's an emerging dictatorship, It's full of corruption and insecurity, and we've done.
And there we had boots on the ground. I mean, a lot of boots on the ground, and it sounds like the prospects based on kind of demographics and stuff were certainly no worse than they are in Syria going into this thing, right? I mean, the prospects for post-war coherence, and we had all these boots on the ground, and it still ain't working out.
No, America has believed that it can control events in these really grassroots revolutions and in a sense civil wars, because let's face it, when the Europeans broke up the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, they drew these rather arbitrary maps and they stuck a lot of different religious communities in one national border, like Syria. Mm-hmm. And those different communities have not figured out how to live together as a nation. They're trying to, and that's what they're going to have to. At the end of the day, they're either going to have to leave and be ethnically cleansed, or they're going to have to figure out some constitutional way of living together. They have not done that. We look in Lebanon, Iraq, the Palestinians and Jews, the Syrians. They haven't figured out how to do that. There is not a good example of a peaceful democratic regime that's really solved its religious communal problem and created a strong sense of national identity. And that's, America cannot control that process. They can't do that for Syrians. And if they think they can get in there and control it and guide it home to the person that they want leading the country, they're fools. And so that makes advising the U.S. government, and everybody wants to know, what should we be doing? And it's very hard to say that there is a right path to be doing something, because Syrians are going to flounder around for some time, I believe, trying to figure out who they are, what kind of government they want, mm-hmm. and how to organize a really muscular opposition, because that's the first problem they've got in their hands, is they've got to take down this regime. And that's going to be a long, difficult process. And until they can organize themselves into one common effort, they're not going to be able to do it.
Well, I suppose we might as well end on the most depressing possible note.
Well, I think, the opposition, look, for all this depression, the opposition has done some extraordinary things. They have broken the wall of fear. They have organized very rapidly. In 1 year, it's extraordinary what they've accomplished. And almost every week or every month, the opposition has gotten stronger. Mm-hmm. Now, in the last month, the regime has really pounded the opposition in Humps and these other places, took the land back, destroyed, killed a lot of them. But, many people are saying it's a Pyrrhic victory, and I think it is. The Syrians, the Sunnis are the vast majority. The Sunni Arabs are the vast majority of Syria. And they have woken up. They are not going to put up with being ruled and having the foot of the Alawite regime or this minoritarian regime on their necks for another decade. They're just not going to put up with it, and they're going to find a way. And the world is on their shoulder. The world is willing to help. They're going to find a way to bring down this regime. These sanctions are already turned it into a nosedive. There is no way that Assad can promise his country a better future, a stable future. He's hanging on only because the opposition is so weak and scattered. But with time, he can't fix Syria. Mm-hmm. There is no Assad fix for this problem. And that's the dilemma. You could see failed state at the end of this and a real mess. But you could also see, if the opposition can get it together, they can pull Syria out of this and create something better somewhere down the road.
Yeah, okay. So you think even without outside intervention per se, just assuming something like a robust supply of kind of even relatively small arms, the regime is, probably gone within a year, or?
I don't know, a year. It could be longer than that, because the opposition is so divided. Countries aren't giving them money with any speed. They don't know who to give it to. There's some deep problems that need to be sorted out. And I do think that the rest of the world is going to begin to give money and arms. I don't think the Gulf Arabs see this as a big opportunity to take down a Shiite regime that's friendly to Iran. So does America. The whole world does. They've been sick and tired of Assad for a long time, and now he's sort of irredeemable. So it'll be the end, but I think it's going to take a lot longer than most people have assumed it would.
So you think he'll probably still be in power at the end of this calendar year? Oh. I mean, I know you don't want to be put on the spot. But...
Well, I do. I wrote an article not long ago saying that he would be in power by 2013. At the new year, that was my prediction. In a year's time, he's still going to be there. Whether he can go for 2 years, I don't know. It's possible if the opposition doesn't get it together. Mm-hmm. But if it does, and it doesn't have to get it very much together, mm-hmm. It's going to overwhelm this regime. This regime can't solve the problem. It's just going to get worse.
And if there were robust outside intervention like we saw in Libya, presumably he could go sooner. But
he's toast. Look, the Syrian military is it's very strong facing Syrians. Mm-hmm. If the American Air Force were to start bombing the presidential palace tomorrow and the major military depots, this regime would fall apart in no time. The soldiers would run for the hills because they're just going to get massacred. America has the ability to kill, thousands of Syrians very quickly.
But you think it's a bad idea because you would still be faced with utter chaos?
You would have a civil war on your hands, and you would have...
So you would still have ongoing civil wars.
It would be like Iraq. There would be looting. It would be crazy. Right. Now, that's why, in a sense, non-intervention, although it's very difficult to do because there's this humanitarian crisis, mm-hmm. I think is less damaging in the long run because Syria has to go through this nation-building process, an identity formation process. And if you look at the more successful states of the Arab world or the Middle East, like Turkey, Ataturk evolved as the father of his country on the battlefield by winning one battle after the next and gaining the respect and the admiration of his people. Abdulaziz ibn Saud in Saudi Arabia, the same thing. It took years of fighting and putting, one tribe after the next, unifying Arabia. Even the Shah, the Pahlavi Shahs, Reza Shah in Iran had to pacify his whole country, and it took them a decade to do it. These guys didn't just get dropped in by the United States and said, okay, everybody follow this guy. They won. They were George Washingtons of their country. Uh-huh. And Syria needs a George Washington. And America cannot invent one for them and expect him to get any respect inside Syria. He's going to have to get that respect on the battlefield by defeating this regime. And I think there'll be less killing in the long run if you allow that to happen. I mean, if we look at U.S. intervention in Iraq, the U.S. had killed 10,000 Iraqis within a month and a half. That's the number of Syrians that have been killed by the government in a whole year. Now, obviously, this can go on for a long time, but America killed perhaps 100,000 Iraqis over the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. So it's not clear that American intervention diminishes the humanitarian crisis. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it could make it much bigger because institutions would collapse and there'd be no army to step in and really become the Syrian government and to supply security. That's why you need a rebel army to find some cohesion and leadership so that it can replace the Syrian army. Mm-hmm. This is the worst of all worlds, is to destroy the Syrian army with no army there to take its place.
Okay, well, this has been sobering and genuinely illuminating, but illuminating in a sobering way.
Thank you. But I think that's, those are the challenges, and they're not small challenges.
No. Well, it sounds like we'll have time. This isn't going to end anytime soon, so maybe we'll have time to check in with you again if you have time to shed light on the next phase.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Okay, same here, Joshua. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.